December 1944. A German prisoner of war stands alone in the frozen darkness of a Texas ranch, digging post holes with bleeding hands, while American guards watch in confusion. In 6 hours, a blizzard will arrive that weather forecasters are calling the worst winter storm in Texas history. In 12 hours, 200 head of cattle will be dead, unless this enemy soldier's unorthodox engineering solution actually works. December 14th, 1944, 0600 hours, Camp Hearn, Texas. The morning air carried the bitter smell of mesquite smoke and coffee grounds as 280 German prisoners of war filed out of wooden barracks into the pre-dawn cold. Camp Hearn, established in January 1943 on 705 acres of former ranch land 40 miles northwest of Houston, housed captured Afrika Korps soldiers, U-boat crew members, and Wehrmacht infantry seized from the beaches of Normandy. By December 1944, the facility held one of Texas's largest concentrations of enemy combatants, all under the watchful eyes of 37 American guards commanded by Colonel William Barrett, a West Point graduate who believed in the Geneva Convention with religious devotion. Among the prisoners stood Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt, 34 years old, formerly of the 21st Panzer Division, captured near Caen in July 1944. Before the war, Reinhardt had been a civil engineer in Hamburg, specializing in bridge construction and structural analysis for the Deutsche Reichsbahn railway system. His hands, calloused from 6 months of cotton picking and field work, still bore the precise, methodical movements of someone who calculated load-bearing capacity before lifting a shovel. The work detail that morning consisted of 20 German POWs assigned to the Morrison Ranch, a 4,000-acre cattle operation owned by Samuel Morrison, a third-generation Texas rancher whose 2 sons were fighting with the 36th Infantry Division in France. Morrison needed labor desperately. His regular hands had enlisted or moved to higher-paying factory jobs in Dallas and Houston, where defense plants offered wages the ranching business couldn't match. The POW program, administered through the War Manpower Commission, provided exactly what Morrison required. Experienced workers at 60 cents per day paid to the U.S. government, plus housing and meals his operation couldn't otherwise afford. Private First Class Daniel Cooper, 22 years old, from Abilene, Texas, supervised the work detail with a Thompson submachine gun slung across his chest and a thermos of black coffee in his hand. Cooper had been declared 4F, unfit for overseas combat, because of a childhood leg injury that left him with a permanent limp. Guarding prisoners in his home state represented both salvation from the shame of staying behind and constant reminder of what he couldn't do. The truck bounced along rutted dirt roads toward Morrison Ranch as dawn broke across flat Texas prairie dotted with mesquite and live oak. Reinhardt sat in silence, watching landscape that reminded him painfully of the North African desert where his division had fought. Endless horizon, sparse vegetation, sky that stretched forever. The other prisoners spoke quietly in German, discussing letters from home, Red Cross packages, the latest rumors about the war's progress. Nobody mentioned the obvious. Germany was losing. Everyone knew. Nobody said it aloud. Samuel Morrison met them at the ranch house, a weathered man of 61 with sun-damaged skin and eyes that assessed everything with cattleman's precision. He addressed the group in broken German learned from Lutheran neighbors in his youth, explaining the day's task. The northern fence line, 3 miles of barbed wire separating his property from the neighboring Schaefer spread, needed reinforcement before winter. Posts had rotted, wire had sagged, and gaps had appeared that allowed cattle to wander. It was tedious, back-breaking work. Dig out old posts, sink new ones, stretch wire tight, secure fasteners, standard ranch maintenance, nothing complicated. Reinhardt worked methodically, calculating optimal post spacing, testing soil density, checking wire tension with engineer's instinct that couldn't be suppressed even in captivity. Cooper watched him with suspicion that bordered on hostility. Every German's efficiency felt like mockery, like they were better at being American workers than Americans themselves. By 1400 hours, temperature had dropped 15 degrees. Wind picked up from the northwest, carrying moisture and electricity that made horses nervous. Morrison studied the sky with expression that combined respect and fear, recognizing patterns his grandfather had taught him 70 years earlier. He walked to where Reinhardt worked, boots crunching on frozen grass. "Storm's coming," Morrison said in English, then repeated in fractured German. "Norther, big one." Reinhardt understood both languages. He'd studied English at university, reading American engineering journals, dreaming once of visiting New York to see the bridges. He straightened, following Morrison's gaze toward the horizon, where clouds were building like distant mountains. "How long?" Reinhardt asked in careful English. Morrison seemed surprised by the language, then shrugged. "Midnight. Maybe sooner. Radio says it might be the worst we've seen. Temperature could drop 40 degrees in 4 hours. Reinhardt looked at the fence line stretching toward the horizon, then at the cattle grazing in the distance. 200 head of Hereford and Angus cross, each animal representing significant capital investment. He calculated quickly: wind chill factor, cattle behavior patterns, fence integrity under stress, drift patterns during blizzard conditions. "The fence won't hold," Reinhardt said quietly. Morrison's expression hardened. "Posts are solid, wires good. What are you talking about?" "Not the posts." Reinhardt pointed toward the fence line's geometry, the slight depression where water pooled, the way prevailing wind would push against the structure. "When the storm hits, cattle will drift southeast, pushed by wind. They'll pile against this fence, seeking shelter. 200 animals, each 500 kilograms, pressed together by panic and wind. The force will exceed the fence's lateral load capacity. The posts will hold, but the wire will snap under horizontal pressure. The cattle will break through." Morrison stared at him. "And then what?" "They'll scatter across open range in blinding snow. You'll lose most of them. Hypothermia, exhaustion, predators. Maybe find half when spring comes." Cooper had approached during the conversation, suspicious of any extended dialogue between prisoner and civilian. "What's he saying, Mr. Morrison?" Morrison explained. Cooper's expression darkened. "Since when do we take engineering advice from Krauts?" "Since this Kraut used to build bridges," Morrison said slowly, still studying Reinhardt's face for deception or manipulation. "You got a solution, or just pointing out problems?" Reinhardt hesitated. Offering solutions meant initiative. Initiative meant risk. A prisoner who attracted attention, either positive or negative, faced complications. Safe approach was to stay quiet, do assigned work, survive until the war ended. But watching 200 cattle die through preventable failure violated something deeper than self-preservation instinct. Engineering wasn't just profession, it was moral obligation. Bridges fell when engineers stayed silent about structural flaws. People died when calculations were ignored for convenience. "I can reinforce it," Reinhardt said. "Different technique, not American method, German railway method, for emergency repairs under combat conditions. Fast, requires minimal materials, provides triple the lateral resistance." Cooper laughed bitterly. "German methods, that's rich. Your German methods are why you're prisoners." Reinhardt didn't respond to the provocation. Morrison, however, understood the mathematics of loss. 200 cattle at current market rates represented $40,000, more than his ranch's annual profit. Pride was expensive. Ideology was a luxury. Survival required pragmatism. "Show me," Morrison said. December 14th, 1944, 14:30 hours, Morrison Ranch, Texas. Reinhardt knelt beside the fence line, pulling a stub of pencil from his pocket. Contraband, technically, but guards rarely confiscated such minor items, and sketching in the dirt. His diagram showed a modified tension system using diagonal bracing, distributed load principles, and what he called flexibility reinforcement, allowing controlled movement rather than rigid resistance. Traditional fence design assumes static load, Reinhardt explained, his English growing more confident as he slipped into engineer's vocabulary. Posts anchored deep, wire pulled tight between fixed points. Works fine for normal conditions. Cattle pushing individually, wind from varying directions, but during blizzard with sustained unidirectional force and mass animal behavior, rigid system becomes brittle. All pressure concentrates at weakest points until catastrophic failure occurs. He drew additional lines. German railway fences near mountain passes face similar problem. Avalanche pressure, sustained wind load, snow accumulation. Solution is dynamic tension system. We install diagonal support cables at 45-degree angles, connecting fence posts to anchor points set back from the main line. When horizontal force hits the fence, the diagonals distribute load across multiple points, while allowing the fence to deflect slightly without breaking. The wire bends, but doesn't snap. The posts lean, but don't fall. Morrison studied the diagram, comparing it mentally to 70 years of ranching knowledge. Everything in Reinhardt's explanation contradicted conventional wisdom. Fences should be rigid, posts should be immovable, wire should be taut. Allowing movement felt like inviting failure. Yet the mathematics seemed sound, the logic defensible. How long to install this system? Morrison asked. Reinhardt calculated, lips moving silently. 3 miles of fence line, 20 prisoners working. We need to install diagonal supports every 30 meters, approximately 160 anchor points. Each anchor requires digging a hole 1 meter deep at 45 degrees, setting a wooden post or metal stake, attaching tension cable to main fence, working in daylight with proper equipment and trained crew, maybe 16 hours. He glanced at the darkening sky, felt the temperature dropping with each passing minute. We have maybe 6 hours before storm arrives. Then conditions become impossible. Cooper shook his head. This is insane. We'd need to work twice normal speed, in freezing weather, following instructions from an enemy prisoner using techniques nobody's ever heard of. And if it doesn't work, Morrison loses his entire herd. Sir, I recommend we just get the cattle into the barn and hope for the best. Barn holds 40 head, Morrison said flatly. What about the other 160? Nobody had an answer for that. The ranch's enclosed facilities had been designed for birthing operations and medical treatment, not mass sheltering during extreme weather. The cattle's survival depended on the fence line holding against the storm's fury. Morrison made his decision with cattleman's instinct, the same gut feeling that told him when to sell, when to buy, when to risk everything on a long shot. Do it. All of you, work under his instruction. Cooper, get on the radio to Camp Hearn. Tell Colonel Barrett we're keeping the work detail here until the fence is done. Emergency situation, Geneva Convention Article 27. Prisoners performing labor necessary to prevent loss of civilian property. Cooper opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Morrison's word on his own land carried weight that military regulations couldn't easily override. He limped toward the ranch house to make the radio call, muttering about German engineers and Texas cattlemen losing their minds simultaneously. Reinhardt stood, facing Morrison directly. Why do you trust me? Morrison considered the question seriously. I don't trust you, but I trust mathematics, and I trust that a man who builds bridges for a living doesn't want to see 200 animals die from bad engineering. War's got nothing to do with cattle freezing to death in Texas. The work began with organized chaos. Reinhardt divided the prisoners into teams, diggers, post setters, cable stringers, fastener crews. He moved among them, checking angles with handmade plumb line fashioned from twine and a wrench, verifying depth measurements, calculating load distribution on the fly. The Germans responded to his authority automatically. He'd been an officer. They'd been soldiers. Wartime hierarchies persisted, even in captivity. Morrison's ranch hands joined the effort, initially skeptical, but gradually respecting the system's logic. Old Jake Henderson, 63 years old and cowboying since he could sit a horse, watched Reinhardt direct the diagonal installation and grunted approval. Looks like what we used to do with teepee poles as kids, tripods stronger than straight post. Same principle, Reinhardt agreed. Physics doesn't care about nationality. By 1600 hours, they'd completed 1/4 mile. The pace was brutal, digging in increasingly frozen ground, setting posts with numb fingers, stringing cable with hands that could barely grip. Temperature had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit and was falling faster. Wind gusted to 30 miles per hour, making every movement an effort against invisible force. At 1700 hours, the first snow began falling, small, dry flakes that stung exposed skin. Morrison distributed coffee from thermoses, sandwiches from the ranch kitchen. The prisoners ate standing up, too exhausted to sit for fear of not rising again. Reinhardt checked his mental calculations, comparing work completed against time remaining. The numbers weren't favorable. "We're behind schedule," he told Morrison quietly. "Ground's freezing harder, slowing the digging. Men are exhausted. We're completing maybe 30 anchor points per hour. Need to increase to 45 to finish before storm hits full force." Morrison looked at his workers, prisoners and civilians alike, all pushed beyond normal limits. "Can't squeeze blood from stone. They're giving everything they have." Reinhardt nodded slowly. Then he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "We changed the pattern. Instead of uniform distribution every 30 meters, we concentrate reinforcement at predicted maximum pressure points. The southern 1/4 mile, where terrain creates natural collection point for drifting cattle, and the eastern section, where fence angles create stress concentration. We leave the northern and western sections with standard fence. They'll probably hold anyway. This reduces required anchor points from 160 to 90. More vulnerable overall, but protects the critical zones." It was the kind of wartime engineering decision Reinhardt had made 100 times during the North Africa campaign, calculating acceptable risk, prioritizing mission-critical systems, accepting partial failure to achieve overall success. Bridges that held tanks but might collapse under artillery fire. Roads that lasted 6 months instead of 6 years. Compromises that kept armies moving while perfectionism would have meant paralysis. Morrison understood immediately. Ranchers made similar calculations. Which pastures to improve, which fences to repair, where to allocate limited resources for maximum survival. Do it. The work pattern shifted. Teams concentrated on the 2 critical sections, moving with renewed purpose now that the goals seemed achievable. Reinhardt worked alongside them, no longer supervising but digging, his officer's status forgotten in shared mission. Hooper watched with conflicted expression, half resentment that a German prisoner was solving an American problem, half grudging respect for someone willing to destroy his hands for someone else's cattle. By 1900 hours, darkness had fallen completely. Morrison brought truck headlights to illuminate the work zone, creating harsh shadows that made depth perception difficult. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees. Snow was falling steadily, accumulation beginning to coat the ground. Men's breath created clouds of vapor that froze on beards and collars. At 20-30 hours, they installed the final diagonal anchor, 92 in total, 2 more than the revised calculation required. Reinhardt walked the entire reinforced fence line one last time, tugging cables, checking connections, verifying angles with frozen fingers that could barely feel the metal anymore. "It's done," he said simply. Morrison looked at the fence, at the exhausted men, at the storm gathering strength in the darkness beyond the headlights. In 6 hours, they would know if a German prisoner's engineering instincts were worth trusting. December 15th, 1944. 0200 hours. Morrison Ranch, Texas. The blizzard arrived with violence that transformed the Texas prairie into something resembling the Russian front. Wind shrieked at 65 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally with such force that visibility dropped to 3 feet. Temperature plunged to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, a 40-degree drop in 4 hours, exactly as Reinhardt had predicted. The ranch house windows rattled in their frames. Outside, the world had become howling whiteness that erased all reference points. The cattle, sensing the storm hours before it arrived, had begun drifting southward exactly as Reinhardt calculated. Their instinct in brutal weather was to turn away from wind, move with the storm's flow, seek any shelter topology might provide. 200 head bunched together, body heat creating microclimate of survival, moving slowly but inexorably toward the southern fence line, where terrain offered slight depression that promised protection. Inside the ranch house, Morrison, Reinhardt, Cooper, and 6 ranch hands monitored the situation through windows already frosting over. The prisoners had been moved into the barn, warmer, more secure, easier to guard, but Morrison had insisted Reinhardt stay in the house, ostensibly to answer questions about the fence system, actually because the rancher wanted the engineer present when his theory was tested. "Can't see anything out there," Jake Henderson muttered, pressing his face against the glass. "Could be cattle piling against that fence right now. Could be nothing. No way to know until morning." "They're there," Reinhardt said quietly, standing away from the window, eyes closed, visualizing the physics in motion. The storm's been pushing them for 3 hours. They've reached the fence line by now. Maybe 180 to 190 animals bunched together, packed dense, each seeking center position where temperature is warmest. The outer ring stands as windbreak, rotating periodically so no individual freezes. Total mass approximately 95,000 kilograms, pressing against the fence with force multiplied by wind pressure. Conventional fence would have failed already, probably around 0130 hours when critical mass accumulated. Morrison checked his watch. "It's 0215. If the fence is still standing, your system's working. If the fence is still standing, the diagonal load distribution is doing exactly what railway engineering predicts," Reinhardt corrected. "The main fence line is deflecting southward, maybe 30 centimeters, while the diagonal cables transfer horizontal force to anchor points set back from the impact zone. The wire is under enormous tension, but spread across multiple attachment points rather than concentrated at posts. Physics is working. Whether the materials hold depends on factors beyond calculation: wire quality, post-wood grain, anchor depth in frozen soil." Cooper sat, cleaning his weapon, maintaining soldier's ritual that provided comfort during uncertainty. His resentment toward Reinhardt had evolved into something more complicated, not quite respect, not quite friendship, something like professional recognition. The German had claimed expertise, then demonstrated it under pressure. Cooper understood that language. Combat soldiers recognized competence regardless of uniform color. "What happens if it fails?" Cooper asked. "The cattle break through and scatter across open range," Morrison answered, voice flat. "We lose maybe 150 head, financial loss of roughly $30,000, enough to force me to sell the ranch, probably to one of the big cattle corporations buying up family operations. 70 years of Morrison family history ends because a fence couldn't hold." The room fell silent except for wind howling against the house. Everyone understood what wasn't being said. If the German prisoner's solution failed, the anger wouldn't be rational. Someone would be blamed. Reinhardt would be blamed. And prisoners of war existed in precarious balance between Geneva Convention protection and the violence that war normalized. Reinhardt opened his eyes, meeting Cooper's gaze directly. "If it fails, it's because I miscalculated. Not because the theory is wrong. I accept responsibility." Hours crawled past. At 0400, the storm reached peak intensity. Wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour, temperature bottoming at 4 degrees Fahrenheit, snow accumulation approaching 16 inches. The ranch house groaned under the assault. Outside, cattle bawled occasionally, sounds barely audible through the wind's roar, confirming their presence and survival. At 0530, Jake Henderson saw something. Lights changing. Storm might be breaking. Dawn came slowly through horizontal snow, revealing landscape transformed into Arctic whiteness. Wind had decreased slightly, still 40 miles per hour, but no longer apocalyptic. Visibility extended to maybe 20 feet. Through the murk, shapes became visible, dark masses against white ground, movement suggesting life rather than death. Morrison pulled on coat and hat, grabbed a high-powered flashlight, headed for the door. Cooper moved to follow, weapon ready. Reinhardt stood but waited, knowing his place. Prisoners don't volunteer for dangerous situations, even if they designed the solution being tested. "Come on," Morrison said, looking back at Reinhardt. "You built it. You get to see if it works." The walk to the southern fence line took 30 minutes through knee-deep snow and lingering wind. Dawn provided enough light to see shapes clearly. Cattle bunched together, their backs covered with snow, creating heat cocoon that had kept them alive through the brutal night. They'd trampled the ground bare in spots, packed together so densely that peripheral animals had no choice but to press against whatever barrier stood behind them. And there, holding against impossible odds, stood Reinhardt's fence. The main fence line had deflected southward exactly as predicted. Not broken, not collapsed, but bowed in controlled curve like a drawn bow. The diagonal cables stretched taut as guitar strings, transferring force to anchor points set back from the impact zone. Several posts leaned at angles that would have spelled failure in conventional design. But the distributed load system kept everything connected. Wire remained intact, strands vibrating slightly under residual tension. 3 anchor posts had pulled partially from frozen ground, but hadn't failed completely. The load distribution meant no single point bore catastrophic force. Morrison walked the fence line slowly, examining connections, checking stability, counting cattle. His expression remained neutral through Ranch's habit of never showing emotion until the count was final. Reinhardt followed silently, mentally cataloguing stress points, calculating how modifications could improve the design, fighting against hope that felt dangerous after so many months of defeat and captivity. Jake Henderson completed the cattle count from horseback, riding the perimeter. He returned with grins splitting his weathered face. 198 head. Lost 2. Looks like they wandered off before the main group bunched. Might find them in the north pasture. Mr. Morrison, that fence held like it was welded to bedrock. Morrison turned to Reinhardt, extending his hand in gesture that crossed all boundaries of war, nationality, and prisoner status. "You saved my ranch. I won't forget that." Reinhardt shook his hand, feeling something break inside his chest, some wall between duty and humanity, between enemy and neighbor, between the war he'd fought and the life he'd once imagined. In this moment, on a frozen Texas prairie with cattle bawling and wind still howling, the war felt very far away. Cooper watched the handshake with expression that mixed emotions too complicated to name. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He raised his hand in salute, not mocking, not ironic, but genuine recognition from one professional to another. "That's solid work, Reinhardt," Cooper said quietly. "Damn solid work." May 8, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. News of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the POW camp through official channels and unofficial whispers simultaneously. The war in Europe had ended. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed. For the 280 German prisoners at Camp Hearn, the announcement brought complicated relief. The killing was finished, but home seemed more distant than ever, and what remained of that home was unknown. Klaus Reinhardt sat outside Barracks 7, holding a letter from the International Red Cross confirming what he'd suspected for months. Hamburg had been destroyed by firebombing. His family's engineering firm no longer existed. His parents' home was rubble. His younger brother Karl, last reported serving with the 6th Army on the Eastern Front, was missing, officially unaccounted for, which meant almost certainly dead, somewhere in the vastness of Russia. The German prisoners would remain in Texas for another year, awaiting repatriation logistics and processing. The Allied occupation needed time to establish infrastructure. Germany needed time to establish government. In the meantime, The prisoners continued working on surrounding farms and ranches, earning 60 cents per day for the U.S. government, sending occasional letters through Red Cross channels, existing in strange limbo between war and peace. Morrison Ranch had become Reinhardt's regular work assignment. After the fence incident, Morrison had specifically requested him through official channels, citing specialized engineering skills valuable for ranch infrastructure projects. Over 5 months, Reinhardt had redesigned the property's water distribution system, improved barn ventilation, and reinforced 3 bridges that crossed seasonal creek beds. The work was purposeful, technical, and oddly satisfying, engineering without destruction, building instead of breaking. On a Thursday afternoon in June, Morrison drove Reinhardt out to the southern fence line, where the modified tension system still stood exactly as installed that December night. The diagonal cables had been left in place, validated by winter survival. Several neighboring ranchers had visited, examined the design, and requested similar installations on their properties. "I've been approached by the Texas Cattlemen's Association," Morrison said, leaning against his truck. "They want to publish your fence design in their quarterly journal. Give it a proper name. Morrison Diagonal Tension System or something official sounding. Should have asked you first, but I already said yes. Figured the Geneva Convention doesn't prevent publishing engineering solutions during peacetime." Reinhardt studied the fence, remembering that desperate frozen night when mathematical theory became physical reality. "It's not my design. It's based on German railway engineering developed over decades. I just applied existing principles to new context. That's what innovation is," Morrison countered. "Seeing how one solution fits different problem. The diagonal concept might have existed before, but nobody thought to use it for livestock fencing. That's your contribution." He paused, then continued carefully. "I've been talking to immigration lawyers. War's over. Repatriation will happen eventually. But given Hamburg's condition, you'd be going back to nothing. There's another option. When prisoners are released, some will qualify for expedited immigration under special provisions. Technical expertise, sponsorship by American citizens, demonstrated good character. I've submitted paperwork sponsoring your immigration. If you're interested." Reinhardt turned slowly, processing words that seemed impossible. "You would sponsor an enemy soldier to remain in America." "I'd sponsor an engineer who saved my ranch," Morrison corrected. "And you haven't been enemy for 6 months now. Just a man who knows how to build things that don't fall down." He shifted uncomfortably, Texan directness struggling with emotional complexity. "Look, my sons will be coming home eventually. They'll take over the ranch and I'll need to step back. But this place is growing. I'm buying adjacent properties, expanding operations. I need someone who thinks about systems and infrastructure, not just cattle and horses. You could work here, earn actual wages, build a life, better than returning to ruins." The offer hung in the air like morning frost, beautiful, fragile, possibly temporary. Reinhardt had spent 10 months imagining return to Germany, rebuilding his family's firm, reconnecting with whatever survived of his past life. But that past was literal rubble now, and the future being offered was tangible, land that stretched forever, work that mattered, community that valued competence over ideology. "I would need time to think about it," Reinhardt said carefully. "Take all the time you need," Morrison replied. "You've got at least 6 months before repatriation anyway." By December 1945, immigration paperwork had processed with surprising speed. 3 letters of recommendation from Morrison, Jake Henderson, and surprisingly Daniel Cooper, who'd written that Reinhardt demonstrated professional competence and personal character consistent with American values of innovation and practical problem-solving, supported the application. On February 3, 1946, Klaus Reinhardt officially immigrated to the United States under technical specialist provisions. He worked Morrison Ranch for 3 years, designing infrastructure improvements while studying for American engineering license. In 1949, he opened a small civil engineering consultancy in College Station, specializing in agricultural infrastructure. The business grew steadily. Ranchers throughout Texas sought his expertise on water systems, fencing, barn design, bridge construction. He married a schoolteacher named Martha Henderson, Jake's daughter, in 1951. They had 3 children, all of whom graduated from Texas A&M University. The diagonal tension fence system became standard design throughout Texas ranching communities, documented in agricultural engineering textbooks and disseminated through county extension offices. By 1960, an estimated 4,000 ranches used modified versions of the technique. Total cattle saved from winter storm losses using improved fence designs was conservatively estimated at 50,000 head over 15 years, representing $2 million in preserved agricultural value. Reinhardt never spoke publicly about his prisoner of war experience, deflecting questions with polite vagueness, characteristic of men who'd fought wars they'd rather forget. But in 1978, at age 68, he was interviewed by a graduate student researching POW labor programs in Texas. The transcript captured his reflection. "I was taught that engineering serves the state, that bridges and railways and fortifications serve national purposes. But standing in frozen darkness on a Texas ranch in 1944, I understood that engineering serves life, human life, animal life, the basic struggle against hostile elements that unites all of us regardless of what flag we salute. That fence wasn't American or German. It was just physics and determination, applied by people who refused to accept that 200 animals should die because a blizzard was coming. I saved the cattle not because I was ordered to, but because allowing preventable failure violated everything engineering means. That night, I stopped being a Wehrmacht officer and became simply an engineer again. It's the person I should have remained from the beginning." Klaus Reinhardt died in 1993 at age 83, surrounded by his family on a small ranch outside College Station. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, ranchers, engineers, colleagues, 3 generations of Morrison family descendants. Among the attendees was Daniel Cooper, retired Army sergeant, who traveled from Abilene to pay respects to someone he'd once guarded at gunpoint. The original fence on Morrison Ranch remained standing until 2008, maintained as historical landmark. When finally replaced due to advanced age and changing property boundaries, sections were donated to the Texas Cowboy Museum in Fort Worth, displayed alongside explanation, "Modified diagonal tension fence system, designed by Klaus Reinhardt, German POW and later Texas civil engineer, December 1944. Represents innovative application of engineering principles under emergency conditions, contributing to livestock survival during severe winter weather and demonstrating that practical problem-solving transcends national boundaries." The true legacy, however, wasn't the fence or the cattle or the engineering patents. It was the quiet proof that humanity persists even through war's darkest moments, that an enemy soldier could care about American cattle, that a Texas rancher could trust a German engineer, that professional respect could bridge ideology, and that sometimes salvation arrives from the most unexpected sources. In December 1944, mathematics and compassion combined on a frozen prairie to prove that good work speaks louder than wartime propaganda, and that building things that survive matters more than the nationality of the person holding the shovel. If this incredible story of unlikely heroism moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community exploring history's most compelling untold moments. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed unexpected acts of courage that crossed traditional boundaries? These stories matter because they remind us that humanity shines brightest in the darkest times. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into history's most fascinating chapters. Thanks for watching, and remember, the best heroes are often the ones we least expect.